Olga Mironova had long been accustomed to the rhythm of sleepless nights, the sterile scent of disinfectants, and the constant weight of decisions that determined whether a patient lived or died. Years of practice had forged in her a calm resilience, the kind that made her colleagues trust her during chaotic emergencies. That night, after another exhausting shift, she stepped out into the cool air, expecting nothing more than the silence of the deserted street and the mechanical hum of the city falling into slumber. The exhaustion in her body was heavy, yet familiar, and she moved with the steadiness of someone who had lived this pattern countless times before. Her phone rang unexpectedly, the sound sharp and out of place against the stillness. Olga frowned and glanced at the screen. The number was unrecognizable, a string of digits that seemed incomplete. When she answered, there was no voice, no words, only a sound. It was rhythmic, steady, and strangely intimate. The sound echoed like the thump of a heart, slow and deliberate, as if someone had placed a stethoscope against her ear. She stood still on the empty street, listening, her own pulse beginning to match the beat. There was something deeply unsettling about the familiarity of it, as though it belonged not to a stranger, but to herself. When the lines suddenly disconnected, the silence that followed felt unnatural, almost suffocating. A few seconds later, her phone vibrated again, this time not with a call, but with a notification. A new message had arrived in her inbox. The sender's name was absent, replaced with a blank space, as if the identity had been erased. Her hesitation lasted only a moment before she opened the email. Inside was a single attachment. It was an image, a medical scan, one she recognized instantly. The grainy detail of a brain MRI filled her screen, showing structures and shadows she had studied for years. But her eyes fixed on the anomaly almost at once. A faint but undeniable distortion appeared on the left hemisphere, a pattern that did not fit any pathology she knew. The date on the scan froze her in place. It was marked 3 days into the future. The timestamp was precise, including the hour and minute, as if it had already been scheduled. Olga's fingers tightened on the phone as she scrolled to the corner of the image. Her stomach turned when she saw the letters typed neatly, almost clinically, in black font. The name was her own. Not just her surname, but the full identification used in hospital records. She had seen countless images like this in her career, but never one that pointed back to her. A cold wind moved down the street, brushing against her skin, but she barely noticed. For a moment, she wondered if exhaustion had distorted her perception, if her mind had conjured this in response to long hours and sleepless nights. Yet the weight of the device in her hand, the undeniable clarity of the scan, and the clinical precision of her name stripped the moment of any illusion. She stood motionless, staring at the screen, her breath shallow and uneven. Logic told her it could be an elaborate prank, some malicious attempt to unsettle her, but the details were too specific, too exact to dismiss. The image looked like it had passed through the same machines she used daily, generated by the same technology she trusted with her patients' lives. The thought that her own future had been captured and sent back to her pressed on her mind like a stone. Olga slowly lowered the phone, the image still glowing faintly in the darkness. Every sound of the city seemed distant now, muffled beneath the echo of the heartbeat she had heard through the call. The steady rhythm continued in her head even after the line had gone dead, resonating with something deeper than her own pulse. She realized she was no longer sure whether the sound had been external or something awakened inside her. That night, the usual comfort of her apartment offered no relief. The shadows in the corners felt heavier, the silence thicker. The scan lingered in her thoughts with each passing hour. The distorted image of the brain, the precise date, and above all, her own name written like a clinical sentence. By the time dawn arrived, Olga understood with a clarity she could not explain. This was not a coincidence, nor a trick of exhaustion. It was a signal, a summons, a beginning she could neither ignore nor escape. Olga stepped into the abandoned wing of the neurological department with an unease she tried to mask beneath her usual calm expression. The long hallway stretched ahead in silence, its walls discolored by moisture and time, plaster peeling in uneven streaks that revealed the raw concrete underneath. The air smelled of dampness mixed with the sharp tang of forgotten antiseptics, the kind that clung to every surface as if refusing to dissipate. Dust hung suspended in the faint beams of light from flickering bulbs, and each of her footsteps echoed too loudly in the emptiness. She advanced slowly, her eyes drawn to the faded signs on the doors, many of which were missing numbers or names. At the far end, a narrow line of light spilled into the corridor from one of the rooms. The glow was weak but steady, as though someone had deliberately left the lamp burning. Olga hesitated, feeling her breath grow shallow, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dim, illuminated only by the small lamp above the bed. A man lay there, his body motionless, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm so mechanical that it seemed disconnected from human fragility. He wore no identification, no bracelet, and no medical records rested at the foot of the bed. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyelids closed tightly as though he were suspended in a dreamless sleep. The monitors beside him registered stable vitals, but his silence was more unsettling than any alarm. Drawn by a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, Olga moved to the bedside table. Its surface was coated in a thin layer of dust, but on top of it rested a single folder, too clean and deliberate to belong in a neglected ward. She opened it cautiously, her hands trembling against her will. The pages revealed familiar names, each belonging to patients she had once treated. She read through their histories, but the dates and diagnoses jarred against her memory. People she knew had died under different circumstances, in different years, from illnesses that did not match what was written. It was as though their lives had been rewritten into a distorted archive, stripped of accuracy and repurposed into something else. Her pulse quickened as she turned the pages, and suddenly her gaze froze. Among the entries was one name that shattered her composure: her mother's. The handwriting was neat and clinical, recording her death as though it had been recent, accompanied by a diagnosis that Olga had never seen. Her mother had died many years earlier, and the circumstances were etched in her memory with painful clarity. Yet here, on this paper, the past was contradicted, altered, and presented as fact. Olga felt the walls of the room close in on her. The lamp above flickered once, briefly plunging the figure on the bed into shadow before reigniting. The man's breathing continued, steady and unbroken, but his stillness seemed more alive than death itself. She clutched the folder to her chest, her mind struggling between disbelief and the creeping certainty that she had stepped into a place where reality had already begun to unravel. Olga descended into the hospital archives with a mixture of dread and determination, her footsteps echoing through the narrow stairwell that led beneath the main building. The air grew colder the deeper she went, carrying the scent of damp paper and metal cabinets untouched for years. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting elongated shadows along the concrete walls. When she pushed open the heavy steel door to the archive room, a wave of silence enveloped her, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. The shelves stretched into the distance like rows of silent witnesses, each stacked with folders of countless lives. Olga moved methodically, pulling out patient files and comparing them with the folder she had discovered in the abandoned ward. At first, the differences were subtle: a date of admission altered by a few weeks, a diagnosis worded with unusual precision, a treatment plan that had never been prescribed. But the deeper she searched, the clearer the pattern became. Many of the original records were missing entirely, replaced by copies with carefully crafted amendments. Her fingers traced the margins of several pages where a peculiar symbol appeared, a spiral drawn with clinical precision, resembling the branching connections of neurons in the human brain. The mark repeated itself across dozens of files, always beside names she recognized. Each spiral seemed to suggest a hidden logic, an unseen hand linking these patients together beyond the boundaries of their illnesses or their deaths. She paused to unfold the crumpled printout of the brain scan she had received days earlier. The same spiral appeared faintly in the corner, almost invisible unless she searched for it. A cold realization swept over her as she held the paper against the altered records. The connection was deliberate. Whoever had sent her the scan was working within the archives of the hospital, manipulating the lives of patients as though they were threads in an elaborate design. Hours slipped by as she pieced together fragments of rewritten histories. In some files, people who had died years ago were recorded as still alive. In others, dates extended beyond the present, describing outcomes that had not yet occurred. The alterations read like drafts of futures yet to unfold, waiting for their moment to become real. And then, hidden among the unfamiliar names, she found her own. Her breath caught as she scanned the entries. The handwriting was unmistakable, consistent with the other altered files, yet the words were filled with impossible certainty. Future dates stretched across the page, listing episodes of illness and decline she had never experienced. Each line felt like a prophecy written under the guise of medical fact. The spiral symbol appeared again in the margin, circling her name as though marking her as central to this hidden chronology. A wave of unease rippled through her as she realized the scope of what she had uncovered. It was not simply that someone was fabricating records. The documents carried the weight of inevitability, as though they had the power to overwrite reality itself. The past and the future blurred together in the sterile ink, reshaping the boundaries of life and death into something mutable and unstable. Standing in the dim light of the archive room, Olga pressed her palms against the cold metal cabinet to steady herself. The sense of control she had always relied upon in her profession slipped away, replaced by the awareness that she was already entangled in something vast and unseen. Every page she turned was another thread, pulling her deeper into a web where human destinies were not recorded but rewritten, and where her own place had already been secured. Olga prepared the equipment with meticulous precision, her hands steady even as her thoughts raced. She connected the unconscious man from the shadowed ward to a set of modern monitors and electrodes, attaching sensors across his temples and chest, arranging the cables like veins of a machine. The room filled with the quiet hum of devices waking to life, the faint green glow of indicators painting her face with an otherworldly light. She positioned herself before the main screen, ready to record whatever appeared, convinced that the data would offer some explanation for the mysteries she had unearthed in the archives. At first, the graphs moved with predictable rhythm. The patient's brain activity revealed slow oscillations, the kind associated with deep unconscious states. Olga noted the stability, relieved for a moment that perhaps this would prove to be nothing more than a residual curiosity of neurology. But as the night deepened and the stillness of the closed ward pressed down on her, the lines on the monitor began to shift in ways that defied her training. Unusual spikes appeared suddenly, forming clusters of patterns that did not belong to a single brain. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing, as the data resolved into overlapping curves, each with distinct characteristics. The contours reminded her of specific patients she had once treated, familiar signatures she had memorized during long hours of monitoring their illnesses. She recognized the jagged rhythm of a child with epilepsy, the broad, slow waves of an elderly woman lost to dementia, the erratic bursts of a man whose final seizure had taken him years ago. They were not echoes of statistical coincidence. They were precise, personal, and unmistakable. The longer she watched, the more the screen transformed into something unearthly. The signals wove together like strands of a hidden composition, forming sequences that resembled music, though not in any traditional sense. The frequencies rose and fell in harmonies that bypassed the ear and went directly to her mind. She could not say she was hearing them, yet her body responded as if she stood within a chorus. The voices of the lost patients resonated in the electrical storm of the display, as if their thoughts had been distilled into waves of light and sound. Her heart quickened when she noticed a subtle alteration in the rhythm. The layered signals began to converge, folding over one another until they formed a sequence more deliberate, more directed. She felt an almost physical pressure in her chest as the lines spelled out a pattern too familiar to be random. Her name emerged in the oscillations, not written in letters, but pulsing in unmistakable cadence. OLJ. Each beat of the machine a syllable of her existence, pronounced by no mouth but carried through the current of the device. For a long moment, she sat frozen, staring at the glowing screen as the realization took hold. The man in the bed was not simply a patient in a coma. His body was a conduit, a vessel through which other lives, other memories, and other deaths passed. He was a medium bound to both worlds, an intersection where the living could encounter the echoes of the dead. The equipment was not malfunctioning. It was translating him. The thought unsettled her more than any medical anomaly ever could. She had devoted her life to separating fact from superstition, to interpreting signals and symptoms with reason. But here, reason collapsed under the weight of what she witnessed. The apparatus did not measure him alone. It measured the fabric of countless others who had crossed the threshold of life. The screens continued to flicker with layered rhythms, each wave a whisper of the past, each spike a reminder of lives she had once touched and lost. Sitting in the dim glow of the ward, surrounded by the mechanical chorus of unseen voices, Olga understood that the patient was no longer simply under her care. He was the axis of something far larger, and she had already stepped irreversibly into its reach. Olga could no longer bear the weight of passive observation. The discovery that the man in the shadowed ward acted as a conduit between the living and the dead had already shaken the foundations of her reason, but the thought of doing nothing became unbearable. She opened the medical records she had found and began altering them with deliberate precision. Dates of diagnoses shifted forward, prognoses were softened, outcomes adjusted, as if her pen could command reality itself. She justified each change with careful logic, telling herself it was no different from adjusting a treatment plan, only on a deeper scale. At first, the results appeared undeniable. A patient marked for a sudden cerebral hemorrhage survived the night and awoke with only a minor complaint. Another, whose file bore the spiral symbol and an imminent date of death, stabilized unexpectedly, his vital signs improving with no clear medical explanation. Each time Olga intervened, she prepared in advance, warning colleagues of complications that had not yet arisen, positioning equipment for emergencies that seemed irrational until the very moment they occurred. She began to sense a terrible rhythm in the work, as if she were dancing on the edge of a script already written, yet not immutable. The exhilaration of saving a life was intoxicating, but it did not last. She soon learned that every alteration carried a shadow. A patient she had never met collapsed in another ward without warning. A nurse she knew only in passing died suddenly from an undiagnosed aneurysm. A child brought into the emergency room arrived lifeless, without cause or explanation. The balance was merciless. Every life preserved was counterweighted by another life extinguished, as if the ledger of existence demanded equilibrium. The man in the bed responded to her attempts as if he were the barometer of her defiance. When she saved someone, his brain activity spiked violently, waves crashing across the screen like a storm. When another death occurred, the lines grew jagged and chaotic before settling into new configurations. At times, she thought she could see entire patterns emerge, vast networks of destinies rearranging themselves in response to her actions. His unconscious body trembled occasionally, a faint twitch of fingers or lips that felt less like reflex and more like acknowledgement. Olga grew obsessed with testing the limits. She wrote and rewrote case files, adjusting the smallest of details to observe how the system would respond. The more she experimented, the clearer the cruel law became. Nothing was erased, nothing prevented. Fate was not annulled by her pen, it was redistributed, shifted from one soul to another. Death was not denied, it was reallocated. The truth settled into her like a weight pressing on her chest. She had not become a savior, but a participant in a machine that demanded balance. Her efforts did not free anyone from the inevitability of loss. They merely moved the burden along invisible lines, creating an architecture of suffering that adapted with every attempt. As she stared at the monitors glowing in the dim ward, she realized the cost of her defiance was not only external. The more she tampered with the records of others, the more her own name appeared in the shifting patterns, each iteration drawing it closer to the center of the spiral she had once thought was merely a symbol. It was no longer just the fate of her patients she was rewriting. The mechanism had begun to write her as well. Olga had reached the end of her strength. Weeks of restless nights had drained every reserve she once relied on, and her dreams had grown into a labyrinth of endless corridors where voices whispered her name. The voices carried the tones of her patients, her colleagues, even her family, all merging into an indistinguishable chorus that followed her wherever she turned. Sleep no longer gave her rest. It became another ward she could not escape, another record she could not rewrite. One night, she found herself drawn back to the old hospital wing. The path there felt inevitable, as if she were following instructions written long before she had chosen to obey them. The air inside was colder than she remembered, thick with the weight of silence. When she entered the familiar room, she saw that it was no longer occupied by the single unconscious man. The beds that once stood empty were now filled. Dozens of figures lay there in unnatural stillness, their faces pale but unmistakable. They were her former patients, the ones she had tried to save and the ones she had lost, each aligned as if waiting for her arrival. Among them, she recognized colleagues who had worked beside her, and even the contours of her relatives, people whose absence had shaped her life. They made no sound. Their eyes remained closed, but their bodies breathed in unison. The combined rhythm of their lungs created a sound that was neither human nor mechanical. It pulsed like the thrum of an immense heart hidden beneath the foundations of the building, each inhalation and exhalation merging into a single force that filled the room. Olga felt her own breathing begin to synchronize with theirs, as if her body were unwilling to resist the pull of the rhythm. The monitors attached to the unconscious man glowed faintly, casting pale light across the ward. Lines of data scrolled upward, and then the display shifted. Names began to appear one after another, familiar and unfamiliar, each a marker of someone whose life had been entangled with the strange balance she had tried to alter. Her eyes scanned the list until they froze on the first entry. It was her own name, written with the same sterile precision as any other patient file. The letters seemed colder than the air in the room, and in that moment, she understood. She was no longer an observer or even an intruder. She had been claimed by the mechanism she had sought to resist, absorbed into the same cycle of lives and deaths that she had tried to defy. A sound pierced the silence. It was the same call she had first heard weeks ago in the dead of night, the one that had begun this descent. The steady, hollow ringing filled the air, impossible to trace to any source, yet it resonated inside her chest as if it had always been meant for her. At that moment, the monitor beside the man emitted a sharp, downward line. His brain activity plummeted, and simultaneously Olga felt a sudden weakness overtake her, her pulse faltering as though it no longer belonged solely to her. The rhythm of the room enveloped her, and her heartbeat dissolved into the chorus of breaths around her. The lamp above flickered once, casting brief shadows that made the still faces appear almost alive, as if they were about to rise and speak. Then the light died completely, leaving only the darkness. In the silence that followed, the rhythm continued, but it was no longer her own. She had become part of it, her existence folded into the endless cycle. Erased as an individual, but sustained as one more beat in the vast,